Hey there. Future space power. Ever wonder how the Space Force keeps running no matter what?
Well, today we're diving into that.
Yeah, today we're looking at the kind of the secret sauce Space Doctrine Publication 4.0.
Or SDP 4.0, as I'm sure you've heard it called.
SDP 4.0 for short, yeah.
Yeah.
And this one is all about sustainment, which, when we're talking about any military branch, sustainment is the lifeblood. Right?
Absolutely, especially yours.
What's really interesting here is that this isn't just, some dry document sitting on a shelf somewhere. This lays out the entire Space Force approach to sustainment, which is making sure that you have the resources, the people, the capabilities, both on the ground and in orbit, to get the mission done.
So think bigger than just wrenches and spare parts.
Exactly. And a key part of this that SDP 4.0 really emphasizes is this idea of the competition continuum. And basically, you can imagine this is a sliding scale. On one end, you've got, handshake agreements. We're cooperating with allies.
Right.
Maybe in the middle, you've got some tense standoffs with rivals.
And then all the way on the other end, you've got full-blown conflict.
Yeah.
And what SDP 4.0 recognizes is that each point along that spectrum, each level of this competition, requires the Space Force to adapt how it thinks about sustainment and how it does sustainment.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole competition continuum thing because it's really crucial to how the Space Force is approaching sustainment, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's start at, we'll say, the calmer end of the spectrum.
Okay.
Before things potentially get a little more kinetic.
Yeah.
So in these situations, what is SDP 4.0? How does it tell the Space Force to think about sustainment?
So in those situations, before things heat up, SDP 4.0 really stresses being proactive. So this is everything from stockpiling supplies to making sure you've got highly trained guardians, strategically placing equipment, even having backup satellites ready to go. It all falls under that umbrella of sustainment.
So it kind of sounds like, we're talking about space, but it's kind of like a space-age version of prepping for hurricane season.
Right.
Like get what you need beforehand.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And you bring up a good point. It's not just about the physical resources, right? Like you need to have those spare parts, but it's also things like, having a backup satellite ready to launch if a vital asset goes down.
Oh, yeah.
That redundancy is built into the system itself.
So if one system goes down, boom, there's a backup ready to pick up the slack.
Exactly. And that goes for personnel as well, training skilled guardians, making sure that you've got experts in all the necessary fields. That's another key aspect of sustainment that SDP 4.0 really lays out.
Always have a qualified guardian ready to step up no matter the mission.
Right, right. And it also highlights, the strategic placement of equipment, resources, thinking ahead about where those things need to be.
Now, why is location, like geographically speaking, I guess, why is location so important when we're talking about space?
Yeah, well, think about it. You've got these remote tracking stations all around the world.
Right.
Getting spare parts, specialized equipment to those locations during peacetime, that's one thing. But imagine trying to do that during a conflict where you might have, disruptions to supply chains, threats to transportation.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to move things around when you're not worried about, enemy action or just logistical nightmares.
Exactly. So SDP 4.0 really emphasizes thinking ahead, anticipating those potential challenges, and positioning your resources in a way that reduces that risk.
So it's all about staying ahead of the game.
Yeah.
But what about just like the day-to-day stuff? Does SDP 4.0 address, how do we keep all this amazing space stuff running?
It does, yeah. It really emphasizes this idea of preventative maintenance for all those space systems. I mean, it's just like, you service your car regularly to prevent bigger problems down the road. Same thing with our space assets. Got to keep them in tip-top shape.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like we're talking about stuff that's really critical, whether or not there's an immediate threat.
Absolutely. A well-sustained Space Force is a Space Force that's ready for anything.
Right.
But situations change, and conflict, unfortunately, is a reality.
Yeah. And so how does this document, how does SDP 4.0 guide the Space Force when things do get real? How does it help you adapt?
Well, that's where this competition continuum that we were talking about really comes into play. Because when we move from, that cooperation or competition phase into conflict, the sustainment game changes. Agility becomes key.
Okay, so things are heating up. What changes? What do you have to do differently?
Well, SDP 4.0, it kind of lays out okay, here's how you shift gears quickly.
Yeah.
You got to start prioritizing what are the most urgent needs right now.
Right.
And that might mean that, that routine maintenance that you would normally do on certain systems, maybe you have to delay that for a little bit because you got to focus on keeping the most critical systems up and running during this conflict.
Yeah, makes it. You got to focus on what's essential for the mission, for that moment.
Exactly.
It's like, we don't need to worry about repaving the parking lot if the building's on fire.
Exactly. And remember those supply chains we were talking about?
Yeah.
Those become absolutely critical during a conflict.
Right.
SDP 4.0 talks a lot about this, about having backup plans, anticipating disruptions, and just knowing how to navigate those roadblocks because they're going to happen.
So it's got to be like having plan B, plan C, plan D in your back pocket just in case.
Exactly. It's all about flexibility. It's about resilience.
Right.
That ability to adapt your supply chains, to get the resources where they need to be, even when things are, pretty crazy in the middle of a conflict. That's a key takeaway from SDP 4.0.
Now, what happens if, God forbid, a satellite gets taken out, whether it's, from an attack or just plain bad luck, a malfunction?
Right.
What happens then?
That's where what they call reconstitution comes in. And SDP 4.0, it addresses this head on. It's about replacing or repairing those damaged assets quickly to minimize the disruption.
Right.
We can't afford to have that downtime. If something gets taken out, we got to get those capabilities back as quickly as possible.
So it's bouncing back, but bouncing back stronger, even under fire.
Exactly. Space is a dynamic environment.
Right.
And SDP 4.0 recognizes that the Space Force needs to be able to recover quickly from any setbacks.
Yeah, it seems like this is relevant. I mean, you don't have to be, the one launching the rockets to understand that, hey, sustainment is what keeps this whole thing running.
Yeah. This applies to every Guardian, no matter what their role is. If you're on the front lines, defending our space systems from cyber attacks.
Right.
If you're an engineer developing some cutting-edge tech, if you're an operator making those real-time decisions.
Right.
Understanding these sustainment principles that are laid out in SDP 4.0, that's vital.
Yeah. It's about being a force multiplier, right?
Right.
Knowing that no matter what you're doing, there's this whole system in place to make sure that you've got what you need to succeed to do your job. And speaking of support, SDP 4.0, it also really stresses the need for robust and resilient sustainment capabilities, especially in these key locations. So what goes into deciding where those locations are? Like, how do you decide where to put a sustainment hub? And what do those hubs need to actually be effective?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into that, but one of the biggest ones is proximity. You want to be thinking about the potential areas of operation.
Oh, yeah.
Where might we need to, if we know a particular region is strategically important, we need to make sure that there are sustainment capabilities in place nearby so that we can support operations in that region.
So forward positioning, kind of.
Yeah.
Like having those supplies, equipment already in place closer to where they might be needed.
Exactly. And it's not just about having stuff sitting around. You also need to have the infrastructure and the personnel in place to be able to receive, maintain, and distribute those resources efficiently.
So we're talking about secure storage facilities, trained maintenance crews, transportation networks, like this whole network to support it.
You got it. And those needs are going to vary depending on where you are, right?
Absolutely.
A sustainment hub in a desert environment is going to have very different requirements than one in the Arctic, for example.
Totally different ballgame.
Yeah.
That's where that adaptability comes into play, right?
Yeah.
Like you were saying before.
Exactly. And it's not just about adapting to different environments. It's also about adapting to different levels of conflict.
Oh, right. Of course.
Right. A sustainment hub that's supporting a peacekeeping operation is going to look very different from one that's supporting a full-scale conflict.
Wow. When you put it that way, it's like it really makes you realize how much goes into just keeping a military force, especially one that's operating in space, running smoothly. It's like this giant logistical puzzle, and it's constantly evolving.
It is. That's a great way to put it. It's like a puzzle.
Yeah.
And like any good puzzle, you need all the pieces to fit together if you want it to work. And sometimes those pieces, they involve working with partners.
You're talking about international cooperation, right?
Yeah.
How does that play into the sustainment strategies that SDP 4.0 lays out?
International cooperation is huge, both in times of peace and in times of conflict. So in peacetime, the U.S. might engage in joint exercises with allied nations. Maybe we're sharing best practices for sustainment. Maybe we're even pre-positioning supplies at each other's bases.
So kind of like having this mutual support system in place.
Exactly, yeah. And then if, God forbid, a conflict does break out, those partnerships, they become even more important.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. might need to rely on those allies for access to things like ports, airfields, or even just secure supply routes.
So it's really about leveraging those relationships to make sure that you can keep those operations going,
Right.
even when things get tough. So it sounds like, this isn't just the Space Force going it alone. SDP 40 really recognizes that, you've got to work with others.
Exactly right. And these partnerships, they're not just about logistics either.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, sharing intelligence, coordinating operations, all of that, that contributes to a more secure and sustainable space environment, for everyone involved.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about this whole competition continuum, the importance of where you put things, making sure you've got that robust infrastructure, and then working with others, that international cooperation. What else, what other key takeaways are there from SDP 40 that we could really hit on?
One thing that really stands out in SDP40 is the emphasis on innovation,
Oh, okay.
particularly when it comes to sustainment in space.
Now that's interesting because, usually when we think about innovation, we're thinking about, new weapon systems or, new spacecraft, super cool stuff.
Right, yeah.
But you're saying it also applies to, how we keep those systems running.
It does, yeah. It makes sense if you think about it, because
Mhm.
space, it presents some unique challenges for sustainment.
Okay.
You can't just, send a repair crew up to a satellite in orbit the same way that you could with, an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, it's not like you can just call your local mechanic.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So SDP40 really stresses the need for developing these new technologies, new approaches to address those challenges.
Okay.
Things like, on-orbit servicing, where maybe you have robotic spacecraft that can go and refuel or repair satellites in space,
Oh, wow.
potentially even extending their lifespan. Or even 3D printing in space. Imagine being able to manufacture replacement parts on demand instead of having to launch them from Earth.
That's wild.
It's really about pushing the boundaries.
So it's about being creative, right?
Yeah,
And it's about, we've got to make sure that we can keep our stuff up there working.
exactly. And it's not just about the technology either. It's also about, how we think about it. Innovating our processes. For example, SDP40 talks a lot about, exploring commercial partnerships, working with private companies
Yeah.
to really leverage the incredible innovation that's happening in the private sector.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you've got companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin out there,
Exactly.
and they are making huge strides. So why not,
Absolutely.
partner up, potentially lower costs,
Right.
use those cutting edge capabilities.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from these like the big ideas behind sustainment in SDP 40 all the way down to like, hey, we need to work with people. We need to innovate. But before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how sustainment is everyone's job.
Yeah.
So for the Guardians who are listening out there, whether they're on the front lines or, more behind the scenes, how can they apply these principles of SDP 40 to what they do every day, no matter what their job is?
Yeah, it really comes down to, even if you think what you're doing doesn't really matter that much, just being mindful of how your actions impact that bigger picture of sustainment.
So thinking beyond your immediate task list.
Exactly, yeah. Like if you're a mechanic, right, it's not just about fixing that problem. It's about, okay, am I fixing it right the first time? Am I documenting my work thoroughly so the next Guardian who comes along has a clear record?
Right.
It's those little things that might seem small in the moment, but they can prevent, a much bigger headache down the line.
Absolutely. Or if you're in procurement, for example, maybe it's about looking at, okay, if we buy this certain piece of equipment, how's that going to impact the supply chain down the road? How is it going to impact maintenance needs?
Exactly.
Thinking about it kind of holistically.
Having that awareness, everything we do is connected in a way.
Yeah.
And even something as simple as, are you properly maintaining your own equipment?
Right.
Whether it's a computer, a specialized tool, whatever it is,
Right.
that plays into the bigger picture.
Yeah. It's about, I guess, taking ownership,
Right.
recognizing that what you're doing, even if it seems small, it has that ripple effect.
It does. And when
Yeah.
you have, when you have every Guardian embracing that mindset, it creates a culture
Right.
of sustainment,
Yeah, I love that. A culture of sustainment. It's almost like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
That's exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what SDP40 is all about. It's about giving the Space Force the tools, the mindset, not just to be prepared for the challenges, but to overcome those challenges and to really thrive, in this new era of space operations.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. I've
Yeah.
learned a lot just in this conversation. Hopefully our listeners are walking away with a good understanding of not just, the what of SDP 40,
Yeah.
but the why it matters
Well,
to
yeah.
every single guardian out there.
Yeah.
Because, at the end of the day, sustainment, yeah, it's about logistics, but it's bigger than that, right?
It is, yeah.
It's about making sure that the Space Force can defend our nation, defend our interests out there in the vastness of space, today, tomorrow, and for generations to come.
Well said. Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, for all you Guardians listening out there, here's something for you to think about. We talked a lot about how SDP 40 really emphasizes adapting, right?
Right.
Adapting to different situations, the whole competition continuum. But as space gets more contested, it's going to get more complex. It's going to get more crowded up there.
Oh, absolutely.
How do you think the Space Force can maintain that sustainment edge? What new challenges are coming? And how will SDP 40 have to adapt to meet them? So, until next time, Guardians, stay sharp and keep reaching for the stars.